In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to the Basilina podcast, the Tholos Talks. Today, we explore the evolving perspectives within the cultural world, as well as the ongoing challenges to the legitimate trade in antiquities. What roles do museums and cultural institutions play in being good stewards of cultural artifacts? How are these institutions playing a growing role in fighting against the illicit trade in antiquities? To help us navigate these pressing questions, we're honored to welcome Dr. Richard Kurin from the Smithsonian to the podcast. As a distinguished cultural anthropologist and leader in the field of cultural heritage, Richard brings decades of experience from his remarkable career, including his role as the Smithsonian's distinguished scholar and ambassador at large. Richard's work has spanned the globe, focusing on preserving endangered cultural treasures and fostering international collaboration to protect heritage at risk. Richard is a visionary and a true leader in this field. Let's dive in. Richard, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
Well, thank you, Deborah. Thanks for having me.
Great. And so you have such a distinguished career across so many different aspects of culture. So I'd just love to hear, how did you get into this field? What attracted you?
Well, look, I was a kid growing up in New York City, working class, and we never went anywhere in my family, but we can go to museums. And in New York, they were free. And so it was so great. I loved going to the Natural History Museum. You can walk into the museum and go anywhere in time and anywhere around the world. To me, it was a great treat. And then later, as I was a student, undergraduate, I went to India. I attempted to do ethnography, and I did some collecting for that Natural History Museum in New York. And that opened my eyes to how other people lived and the importance of understanding cultures around the world. So I got a PhD in anthropology, University of Chicago, went to the Smithsonian, and, have been here for almost 50 years.
So you've seen a real change also in how museums approach collecting and even what public attitudes have been towards the collections themselves. And how do you see those changes evolving?
I think in the early days, and one of my mentors was Dylan Ripley, who was a famed secretary of the Smithsonian who really built it. He said, museums are a place people go after a heavy Sunday dinner. Not a great endorsement of what museums do in society.
Yes.
And there was the fetishism of museums, in objects and collections. You got to be quiet in museums. Of course, you can't touch anything. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea was museums were kind of removed from life. Mm-hmm. And I think what Ripley and a whole era of museums now over the past few decades have been is museums getting closer to people, more involvement, more collaboration, and more recognizing their civic role to use these collections for the uplift of society, for education, for transferring knowledge. Curators, educators in museums used to be pretty removed and often, regarded as pretty pointy-headed and elitist about their collections. And I think museums have made a transition to being much more part and enmeshed in society.
And we certainly see that in a number of the museums that are being built today. They're much more interactive. Even I think the Smithsonian has taken a much more interactive role with the activities and events. I mean, you started the Heritage Festival in the summer that allows an opportunity to showcase heritage.
I was young then. I came in, it had already started. But, I spent several decades working on the Folklife Festival on the National Mall in Washington. And that came as a result, again, of Secretary Ripley saying, hey, we have instruments in cases. Take the instruments out of the cases and let them sing. They were played, they were danced to, they were used for composition. And of course, we've done everything from, having, a Silk Road program, massive Silk Road program with Yo-Yo Ma and artists from, 28 countries, hundreds, for an audience of over 1.5 million people on the wall, where people could see how everything from music to porcelain in China, to silk weavings, to everything that transpired along that Silk Road was made by real people. And we had that on the mall with the real artists. So people get a sense that culture is really alive, and these collections give us a window into the past, but also present of artistic creativity and of innovation. My first week working for the Smithsonian, Deborah, back in 1976, we
Mhm.
opened the Air and Space Museum. And that was America's birthday present to itself in 1976 on our bicentennial year. That museum, millions, hundreds of millions of people have visited that museum. How many people have come through that museum? How many astronauts and designers and all sorts of physicists and others
Mhm.
have come through that museum and said, I went there as a teenager. I looked up at those rocket ships hanging. I saw those Apollo spacecraft. I saw that technology, and that inspired me to become an astrophysicist, to discover new worlds and planets or design new aircraft. So, museums have that role of inspiration that not only looks at the past, but gives people a sense of where their horizons are and what they can achieve in the future.
Yes, and it must make you feel very good when you hear those stories about the inspiration of the museums. So, talking about collecting, this podcast is focused in this series on some of the issues around protecting heritage. And the Smithsonian really has been a leader in setting the standards for collecting in recent years and provenance research of its artifacts. You have spearheaded that effort for some of the museums, and I wonder if you could share some of the steps that the Smithsonian has taken just to ensure the legitimacy and the provenance of its collections.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because museums have generally they acquire things. I mean, they're acquisitive. In the Smithsonian, we have 160 million things.
Wow.
That's a lot of stuff. That's the technical term for collections, right? The idea is that for many an era, museums were in the acquisition business. And the Smithsonian itself, received many of its collections from the U.S. government. So we received military collections, we received things that were donated to the United States, received stuff that was acquired. You have all this stuff. And the primary thing for museums was to gather it in.
Mm-hmm.
Then having to deal with the responsibility of actually storing it, taking care of it, and documenting it. And there was always a lag because there was more stuff than museums could handle. But in many cases, museums worked with the archaeological community. They sent out expeditions, and people dug up ancient sites and antiquities. And the idea was to bring them back to the United States or bring them back to Europe. And it was during an era of, colonial control in many cases. There was a system in archaeology called partage, where some of the stuff would stay in the country and other stuff would come back to those museums. I think museums realized that, in many cases, they were acquiring stuff that was of questionable, legal title. Was this really proper? In other cases, you had artwork, and art, culture, antiquities are sometimes one of the victims of war, where, things are looted, places are looted. We see that today. We've seen that, in Iraq with the Iraqi museums. We're seeing it in Sudan. We're seeing it in Ukraine, in areas of Russian control, where, people take things. Then the idea is, okay, do museums close their eyes to that, or do they really investigate it? And I think at the Smithsonian, we're the National Museum of the United States, we have a responsibility to do things that are both, certainly legal, but also ethical and proper. And so, we started the Provenance Research Project to really look at our collection in some detail. Some of it grew out of work victims of the Holocaust and Nazi looting during World War II, where the Nazis indeed acquired and forced people to give up their artworks, give up their treasures. They raided national institutions. The Soviets did the same thing in the aftermath in acquiring. So the question is, okay, we need to really look at our collection and then go back to the people whose stuff this was. We've also had to deal with it domestically when we were working on the legislation for the American Indian Museum. And you had a champion of that like Dan Inouye and Ben Nighthorse Campbell, was bipartisan, Senate and House. But the idea was, with the development of the American Indian Museum, we recognized that a lot of artifacts we had in the Smithsonian, from sacred objects to human remains, were retrieved as a result of wars with various Indian tribes over several decades. And so that museum, with the founding of that museum, it called for the repatriation and return of certain objects that were in certain classes. And so between the issue of looting in the Holocaust, issue of having these native remains, and our understanding of what our kind of moral duty was with regard to native people, we started developing those policies of really researching and understanding the nature of our collections.
Yeah, it, I think really set a standard not only in the US, but globally compared to what some of the other museums are doing and steps that they've taken related to their own provenance. And you talked about museums being out in the field. And one of the things I know that you have created is the Smithsonian's Cultural Rescue Initiative, where you are sending archaeologists and others out into the field in times of crisis.
We started going big, I think. Smithsonian has always helped, during various crises, whether in conflict or natural disaster. But the one that really propelled us was in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. Over 200,000 people died. The society's infrastructure, was wrecked. People were living out on the streets. And, while the Smithsonian, is not in a position to provide food or healthcare or other things that were needed, other people stepped forward with that. The Haitians really survived, and it brought home the lesson to me. The Haitians survived because of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
I'd done a good bit of work in Haiti, worked with a lot of cultural colleagues and leaders. And for those first few days after the earthquake, you had basically almost 3 million people living out on the streets in Port-au-Prince and surrounding areas. How did people survive? They didn't have food. They didn't have water. They didn't have shelter. They didn't have health care. How did they survive? They sang.
Wow.
They sang. And that provided strength. And we know, for people around the world, sometimes when you're at the end of your rope, when things are very desperate, what do? That's when you pray the hardest.
Yes.
That's when you reach deep in and have that, what gives you that resilience, that will to survive. And so we saw it in the Haitian people. It was their culture, it was their sense that they had survived so much. After decades, they had become an independent republic in 1804. They abolished slavery, and they've had a hard time ever since. But their culture gave them the strength. And so we at the Smithsonian led an effort among U.S. government and NGOs, as well as international groups, to work with Haitians to save their cultural heritage, because we thought that was the kind of their cultural DNA embodied their future. That's what their children, the next generation, would be inspired by, their historical tales, their artwork, their various accomplishments. So we took over the UN building in Port-au-Prince. I sent down 160 people voluntarily, people from the Smithsonian, institutions all over the country and around the world. We ended up saving about 35,000 artifacts, training over 100 Haitians, and really recovering their national archives, national library, various museums, and so on, saving murals in churches and artwork and working very closely with various cultural communities in Haiti. Well, that was very successful. We got a lot of private support. We got some U.S. support as well, government support. And I got a call from Samuel Sidibe, the head of the National Museum of Mali. Mm-hmm. We'd worked with him at the Smithsonian for the Folklife Festival. He said, "Richard, I heard what you guys did in Haiti. How about Mali? They're burning manuscripts. They're burning these ancient manuscripts in Timbuktu. They're destroying these shrines. Can the Smithsonian help?" Well, now we were in business.
Yes.
And I was inspired by the business in that by somebody well, Corey Wegner.
Yes.
Corey had been a curator up in Minneapolis, the Institute of Arts, but she was in the reserve, Army Reserve. She was called up during the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and she worked with folks at the Iraqi Museum to save the collections there and help save the Jewish archives as well. Mm-hmm. And she was a real monuments woman.
Yes.
And so really, I was undersecretary at the time, but the good thing about a leader is you listen to people who know what they're doing and you have faith and trust in them. And so I was really inspired by Corey. And so I brought her to the Smithsonian, and we established the unit, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. And then we were involved in Syria and Iraq, and after the earthquake in Nepal, and domestically as well, when hurricanes hit Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Mm-hmm. We send people in to help those people on the ground save their cultural heritage. We started doing training and other programs, providing supplies. it goes on to this day, right now, like today. It's a need that nobody else was kind of fulfilling, but I think it's really propelled folks around the world, and it's had all sorts of consequences for other foundations. We work with the Antiquities Coalition. We work with the Olive Foundation, UNESCO, ICRAM, which is the International Cultural Conservation Network. And so I think we've brought more knowledge, know-how, resources to it, and saying, once this kind of cultural heritage, and you know this well, Deborah, with your work, once you lose some of this heritage, it's gone. It's gone forever. It's not replaceable. You can't just rebuild it. And that goes certainly for collection items. It goes for cultural sites. It also goes for intangible cultural heritage, where sometimes you see so much disruption because wars create immigrants, people who are we saw this in Iraq, where people who lived in the marsh Arabs and so on, maintained a wonderful culture for thousands of years. All of a sudden, the marshes are drained. They go to Basra, they go to cities, and they lose that knowledge of boat building and environmental knowledge and so on. So we've tried to play a role in saying, let's not lose this precious resource that's really irreplaceable, and let's do what we can with it. Same thing with looting. We've worked very closely with the FBI. We train FBI agents. We work with the FBI crime team. We work with Homeland Security agents. We work with the Customs and Border Control, because again, once these items are looted, they go out of public view. They end up in somebody's basement.
Right.
They end up, private collections removed from the very people that created them and the very people that can gain the most from them. So we've worked on that. We've worked on monitoring looting. We've done repatriation. Remember a few years ago, and I think you were there at the Smithsonian, we were returning, I think it was something like 16,000 items that had been looted from Iraq, including one tablet, the Dream tablet from Gilgamesh. Hello, that story.
Right.
And so you want to return it to people so that it can be appreciated and it can inspire future generations to create cultural heritage new. Cultural heritage is built every day.
Yeah.
But it's not built on a vacuum. It's built on the fact that we have museums. So an art student can walk into the museum, see something in the wall and say, hey, I'm going to do it better or differently. And that's going to create new art. We want somebody to walk into that technology museum, look at a satellite or something, say, I could do that better. I'm going to be a designer. I'm going to be an aerospace engineer, and I'm going to build our future. So it's important to preserve that past, but it's preserving the past because in that is to our future.
Absolutely. And it's protecting that economic value, both the pride of the history and the culture, but then whether it's the intrinsic value of the item itself or what you can do around the item. And I know we've talked a lot about just the simple fact at an archaeological site, if you put a wall around the site, it not only helps better protect it, but now you can charge for entrance and have guides, and it has a multiplier effect through the communities.
Well, totally. Yeah, totally. Right now, one of the things we're at work with, we're working with the Louvre, working with the World Monuments Foundation, Olive Foundation, of course, Iraqi partners, in rebuilding the Mosul Museum. Mm-hmm. Well, you certainly listeners will remember seeing those videos of ISIS, guys in that museum taking sledgehammers to sculptures and busting them up. They looted anything they could carry, and they destroyed anything they couldn't. Well, that museum is right in the middle of Mosul. Mosul, 1 million people have returned after, having evacuated Mosul because of ISIS and the terrorism that was going on there. And that museum, we're hoping to become a center of rejuvenation of Mosul. I mean, the whole old city was so destroyed. I mean, remember, that was the last refuge of ISIS, Iraq. And it's an ancient city. It goes back to biblical times. There's people that would want to come to Mosul because it was a center both of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, of various other religious sects and so on. And so the museum can play a vital role, a linchpin role in rejuvenating that city, educating its kids and creating all sorts of industries. People go there, you need restaurants, you need hotels. What drives part of the economy of New York? It's having museums and Broadway and a lively cultural scene. That's what's driving it. It's not steel plants in New York City. Same thing in Washington. We're well aware of the role of the Smithsonian, where we get, upwards of, we used to get pre-COVID about 30 million visits a year.
Wow.
We're getting back to that, but that generates billions and billions of dollars in the local economy. And even if people are coming to do lobbying and politics in Washington or do business or whatever it is, they'll stay an extra day. They'll bring their family along for a weekend so they can go visit the museums. Those extra days, each one of those adds thousands of dollars. Multiply that by 17 million people, and you have a lot of money that museums and culture are generating for the area and for business. That is taxed and feed back. Culture is a great investment. People don't really realize it. They always think culture costs them money. Well, it may have some upfront cost, but over the long run, it generates money for the economy.
Well, and that's an excellent reminder in these times of the role that culture and museums can play. Before we leave the heritage issue, I did want to ask, because of the work that you do in crisis, and we know many times in times of conflict, culture is the first thing that's targeted as a way to intimidate and try and erase or change history. And certainly you've been a leader in some of the work that's happening in Ukraine. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that as a very recent example of really interesting work Smithsonian has been leading.
As we work in other countries, we started developing tools for satellite monitoring. And we started doing that with Armenia and Azerbaijan, given their conflict. We started doing it in disaster zones again, second earthquake in Haiti. And then we got some support from the National Science Foundation and others to really develop satellite monitoring capability. And so we would get use of both commercial images as well as U.S. government images. And so we took that on very early on in Ukraine, actually before Russia invaded. And we had identified about 28,000 sites in Ukraine that were cultural heritage sites, not just, those dozen on the UNESCO list, but graveyards and synagogues and churches and mosques, memorials and outdoor sculptures and libraries and so on across Ukraine. So just imagine 28,000 dots on a map of Ukraine. And basically we had satellites monitoring each one of those sites. And we were able to monitor where you saw explosions or fires, which indicated what they call kinetic events, right? Like a missile hitting something.
Yes.
So call those red dots. Wherever any day we saw these explosions or fires, and then you transpose the red dots with the blue dots, the 28,000, and you start then focusing in and looking very carefully at the imagery of what happened through the day at that particular site. So we developed a partnership with the State Department to monitor the destruction, because purposeful destruction of cultural sites is a crime. It's a war crime under the Hague Convention. So we work very closely. The Smithsonian does training with the monuments, men and women. We stood that up, again, a largely result of our Corey Wagner as a monuments woman. And that also came about because all the generals at the Pentagon wanted to be George Clooney. I mean, they really liked the movie. that really helped. So here we are monitoring these things, and then we could let our Ukrainian colleagues know, hey, here was a museum. It's, 50 miles from Kyiv. It looks like it got hit last night. You may be able to salvage something from it. So we started building up a catalog and documenting all these cases, and then working with our Ukrainian colleagues on the ground, a whole network of people, government, non-government, to document what was happening, because, you do have a cultural war crime, but also to be able to retrieve things, in some cases retrieve collections from places, retrieve artwork, and so on. So we've been using that's gone on daily since, really before the conflict started. Our partner in Ukraine on that, a guy named Ihor Poshavalo, is the head of the Maidan, the kind of Dignity and Revolution Museum in Kyiv, documenting their independence movement. But we got to know him because he was a Fulbright fellow at the Smithsonian. And he watched what we did in Haiti during the earthquake in our work, the Smithsonian's work. And he said, one day we might need this in Ukraine. Well, he was right. And we've done so much training, largely through the internet, with Ukrainians. Said, well, how do we preserve our stuff? We've provided supplies.
Mhm.
So at the beginning with Ukraine, because of the bombings and shellings and so on, the biggest demand was fire extinguishers. So we and others bought every fire extinguisher in Europe. You know, then it was as people took collections out of museums and put them in basements and underground and so on, they needed dehumidifiers because of mold, so one thing leading to another. People needed cartons. And one Saturday morning, I got a call from the head of one museum Corey and I did. They had over 400,000 biological specimens that they needed to move in a university museum, from whatever floor it was on, and very susceptible. How do you move 400,000 things, in a matter of days? I can't move my living room in a matter of days. So we were really wrestling with our Ukrainian colleagues about how to do this well. Wintertime in museums and storage facilities, how do we protect stuff when there's no heat?
Mhm.
How do we do that? So Smithsonian curators were grappling with Ukrainian curators and conservators almost every day. How do we protect stuff? So we've continued to do that kind of work. We stood up a unit. Our monuments officers in the United States
Mhm.
convened with those from Ukraine, and we stood up a unit in Ukraine. So they would have a monuments officers unit as well. So we did that. And then again, we've worked with our Ukrainian colleagues on documenting looting. So we have on tape satellite imagery. Here's, at the Kherson Art Museum, 3 weeks after Putin claimed that this oblast was annexed to Russia,
Mhm.
two big semi-tractor trailer trucks and a panel van pulling up to the Kherson Museum and taking 10,000 items. And those trucks go to Crimea, to a museum, a Russian-controlled museum in Crimea. Well, we have that on tape. It's there, the imagery, the so on. So it takes a really intensive effort to do something like this, in a lot of commitment. But in the end, I think it's work that has to be done.
Well, it is gonna pay off for many years, both in taking it to the courts, if we can do that through the international courts and going after them for cultural crimes, but also as many of these items find their way out into the legitimate marketplace, you'll at least have a record of where they came from and that they were looted.
We work with our State Department and FBI colleagues, and also Homeland Security and other museum colleagues around the world, as well as law enforcement, to try to develop stronger ways of doing that. So at the Smithsonian, I would often get I'd come to the office on Monday morning, and some customs outpost in Bellingham, Washington would say, hey, we just stopped a truck. It was coming in from Canada. There's about 3,000 objects in it. It looks like they're from China or something. Are these tchotchkes? Are these souvenir things? Or are these real items? And so literally they took pictures of each one. How do they know what's an ancient Chinese artifact or what's legitimate Chinese sculpture or a scroll painting or whatever?
Or
So
the Xi Jinping era versus Ming era.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So basically, I had a team of 5 or 6 of our curators at our National Museum of Asian Art
Mhm.
look at all these pictures and go through them and, handing them off to different specialists. And we have other partners who do that work. The University of Pennsylvania has played a big role in trying to connect experts in various things to respond to Customs and Border Patrol issues of, here we have looted. Is this Ukrainian? Is it, is this from Sudan? Is this from Syria, Iraq? Is it legitimate? Is it, just some contemporary item that's an imitation? So it's very labor intensive because you need experts who know about this stuff.
Mhm.
Well, we're starting to look more and more at using advanced technology and artificial intelligence to do that work.
Mhm.
And so we're hoping we can get to the point using extant museum collections where we have a great database where we can teach AI to recognize stuff so that literally you can hold up your iPhone to an object. Let's say it's a, ceramic vase, looks to be Middle Eastern style. You can hold up your iPhone to it. It could go, whatever it does.
Right.
and identify something in a museum collection that looks like it, and then be able to compare it. And, you can't test the materiality of it. So you don't know whether the ceramic is 10 years old or, 1,000 years old, but at least you have a primary fascia case for saying, hey, let's hold this for additional testing or looking at, because this could be, well, if you can do that, you can really save on a lot of that people power. It takes an enormous amount of time and really restrict the number of objects you're looking at to really interdict, smuggling and the trafficking of antiquities and art. So we're looking for new technologies all the time that can help us do that work.
That's just amazing. And I think you've touched upon some of the challenges, which is in part just getting a valuer recognizing where these items are from, especially when modern borders are very different than ancient borders, and try to pin down exactly what region they come from, let alone what country or city. So what are some of the other big challenges that you're finding today for the museums?
Well, look, museums are always looking for more money because they want to exercise their, responsibility for conserving and preserving the collections that are in their care. That's one. And we do periodic, for example, at the Smithsonian, periodic inventories and so on. But, again, when you have 160 million items, that's a pretty big inventory. And,
Also a place where modern technology will help.
Well, you'd think, it's also how you count, so I remember dealing with one congressional committee asking about, our objects, like how many airplanes, for example. Our Air and Space Museum has a magnificent collection from, spaceships and astronaut gear to airplanes and so on. But a lot of our planes are not stored as full planes. We take the wheels off, we take the engine here, the wings go there, so they're in crates all over the place. So managing those collections and making sure you're preserving the collections are important. We started a program some years ago of distributing our collection to museums around the United States, because why should it be in a storage, somewhere in Maryland? Why not have it in a museum somewhere else? In fact, the largest object in the Smithsonian's collection is a Saturn V rocket. Those are the rockets used for Apollo.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we loaned one. One is on loan to the Air and Space Museum in Alabama, where they have space camp. Well, the museum there built a building around that satellite. It's like the size of a football field. So we'll probably never get it back. But the idea of taking stuff that's stored in places in museums, 99% of our stuff is in storage, to get it out so that people can see it, be inspired by it, and use it. So that's a challenge, moving stuff around and getting it out. The other one is moving it around digitally. I think the idea is that, what we can't move physically, and it costs a tremendous amount of money, is how can we make our collection more accessible in digital form? And I think museums more and more, not only around the United States, but around the world, are trying to do this so that everybody can have access to everything 24 hours a day. And that really broadens its educational use and use for various purposes. That takes money, digitizing stuff. Our stamp collection is pretty easy. You put a stamp on a copier and you digitize it, But when you're digitizing Apollo 11, you're digitizing the Space Shuttle Discovery, it's a big job. So there's more money needed for digitization and so on. And then there's always money needed for research, because it's not just keeping the objects as an object on a shelf or in a case or in a crate, but it's doing the research to understand that. And so, you could take the most basic things, even like, the Smithsonian has the Wright brother flyer, that first flyer that flew in 1903 at Kitty Hawk. Well, we have researchers who've, spent a lot of time trying to understand, how did that work?
Yeah.
How did it actually work? How did those Wright brothers modify the plane over time to get it to work? What was that process? So it's not just the material form of the final plane, but how can we understand the intellectual process, the process of innovation and discovery that led humankind to flight? Just think about doing that with so many things in our collection that were invented or innovated, even artistic techniques to understand brush strokes or understand how an artist laid out a scene and then modified it, that we can understand, through various, kinds of x-rays and things we do to understand the development of a painting. So supporting that research takes a lot of work because those are bodies, those are people with specialties in the sciences and the arts and the humanities so they can do their work.
Yes. So you've given us lots to think about the roles of museums and leadership that certainly the Smithsonian has talked about. And there's always a lot of talk about some of the negative aspects, but we like to end on a positive note. And so as you sort of look ahead in this field, what do you see as some of the silver linings and what gives you hope and inspiration since you've given so much inspiration to others?
Thank you. Those are kind words, Deborah. I appreciate it. For me, there's a lot of conflict in the world. There's a lot of conflict in our country. We get battered by so much information and misinformation all the time that I think if we look at places like museums, places like libraries, they're trusted. Their trust is a heck of a lot more than most other institutions, and they provide safe civic spaces that are dedicated to learning. And, there was a wiser person than me once said, if you think knowledge costs us a lot of money, the pursuit of knowledge, think about how much ignorance costs us, in terms of death, destruction, incivility, inhumanity to human beings. And so I look at museums as a place that it's a positive civic space. It's open to all. In the United States, many of our museums are free, libraries are free. And the whole idea that Americans and people around the world can benefit by having access to knowledge to hopefully make the world a better place. And I think museums occupy that kind of special place for people. Look, sometimes we'll get it wrong. Sometimes a curator has a particular point of view. Another curator has another point of view. Science works like that as well. You do an article and you make a discovery and another scientist publishes a thing that says Deborah was wrong. Okay, that's how it proceeds. Knowledge proceeds, it builds on itself. And so having that kind of debate that's based on evidence, on logical understanding and so on, and doing that through museums is not a bad thing to do. So I have a lot of faith that museums will carry it forth. Smithsonian was founded for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, an enlightenment thing. And the guy who donated his money that started the Smithsonian never set foot in this country, James Smithson. He left the United States and the people of the United States his fortune to say, pursue knowledge and its diffusion. That was a remarkable charge given at that time we were a very young nation. He wrote that will in 1826. And so I think fulfilling that purpose of increasing knowledge and spreading it around is a good recipe for human progress.
Well, Richard, it's been just a very rich discussion, and certainly the Smithsonian has lived up to the ambition of its founder. And I'm sure that he would be very proud as he would look back if he could be aware of all that has been accomplished. And you have really been a true leader in setting the tone for what the Smithsonian has done, particularly in cultural heritage. So thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Well, and thank you, Deborah, for your good work. And, we've worked together on a number of projects, and I'm very proud of that. You've been a leader as well. Great to participate in this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Tholos Talks with our guest, Dr. Richard Kurin. Join us next time when we'll explore the concept of cultural diplomacy and how culture can serve as a powerful diplomatic tool. Stay tuned as we continue to shine a light on the critical issues facing the illicit trade in antiquities.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilean Institute. Available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilean website.